We are going to move from a resilience to a natural brilliant state.
We're all here to move our Black communities forward.
We think our children have to have the best. It's all about discipline.
How are we going to discipline ourselves so that we're able to save, so that we're able to make good financial decisions?
Recognizing that there's a road ahead if you manage the road in front of you.
The decisions that you're going to be making today in your lives where it comes to money will affect you in the future.
Discipline is one of the things that we often learn, sometimes by our environment, or sometimes we're forced to do it, and sometimes we don't learn it at all.
Stores want to get us in and out and get our money, and that's it. It's a game, so you have to be really wise to the game.
Do you know what it costs to run your home on a monthly basis?
Beautiful good morning to you and yours. Everybody joining us here on the virtual this morning. It is a beautiful Saturday morning.
Yes.
Thank you very much for being here with us, spending your morning with us, speaking the language of the community. And financial literacy that speaks the language of the community is what Community Spaces is all about. Good morning, Tika. How are you today?
I'm well, Roderick. Good morning. Good morning. It is very warm and sunny outside. It's going to be a beautiful long weekend. So this is a very fruitful way to starting our weekend, and we'll learn something before we go off and enjoy the weather and the birds.
Absolutely.
The birds are family time.
Absolutely. And while we have the tropical weather with us, I definitely do encourage everybody to get out, get that exercise, and enjoy those people who are within our lives. So yeah, we had an amazing session last week in terms of Dr. Enriquez. She shared so much with us in terms of economies, and I'm looking forward to this week. How about yourself? What did you take away from last week?
As am I. I think the one thing that I learned is everything is an economy, and so many things go into making one product, and we really have to be mindful and informed when we're looking at creating our businesses and sustaining our businesses. This week's session is focused on the economics of information and importance of human capital. So certainly looking forward to the second session. To everyone that's joining us, please note that last week's recording is on the BBPA's YouTube page. And at the end of the session, we'll share where you can go and find those. A few housekeeping things before sort of Rod leads us in. Please note that this session is being recorded, and so for privacy issues, you can change your name as it appears, and you can turn your camera off. But when we have questions, we always like to see your lovely face, so we may invite you to turn your cameras on then. Please post questions in the chat or raise your virtual hands. We're monitoring both. And then Rod and I will invite you to ask your questions about the session.
Absolutely. So I guess without further ado, let's jump right into it. Dr. Enriquez, how are you this morning?
I'm fine, thank you. How is everyone?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. Okay.
Yes,
long weekend. Look, long weekend. As a professor, I know when there's long weekends and I teach on a Friday, usually there's less people. So the people who are here are amazing. Luckily, this is being recorded. I'm going to be talking about information, human capital, and productivity, really important, and have some questions for you. How do you hire people? What information do you use? These are things that are really important also for young people, so they understand how the system works as well. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. I'm also going to first begin the talk with answering some of Roderick's questions that he had at the end. And so anything that you bring at the end, you say, can you give me more information? I start the talk with that and then move on to the talk so that we have a continuity between sessions. So if you missed last week's session, you have to go and let the YouTube to see what's going on. All right, is that cool?
Sounds
Yes,
good.
thank you.
All right, I will do that. Let me share my screen. There we go. Do you see my screen now?
We do, yeah.
Excellent. So let me just do some adjustments here. So today we're going to be talking about information, human capital, and productivity. And what's really interesting about this, the agenda, is, of course, first I'm going to respond to last week's questions. We're going to talk about data sources on Canadian and Toronto economy. Someone asked me where to find this. I'm going to show you where it is. Leading indicators that can help you predict where the economy is going to be heading, what to look for. If you want to know, is the economy improving? Well, I'm going to show you some data. I'm going to give you a list of the type of data you look for. If you see that getting larger, then you should say, okay, the economy is improving. And also I'm going to give you some data on SMEs, that SMEs can use to look at what's going on. Fair enough? All right. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk about the economics of information and then move on to something called human capital, which is us, all right? Investment in our capital, who we are, and also how that links to productivity in the workplace. And that's what makes the whole country richer as a result. So information. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just click on, this is the best information you can get, is from Stats Canada. Okay, so you click on here, and as I said, you can get access to, I don't know why that got small. Sorry about that. Let me just move this here. So there you go. So this is Stats Can when you get to the page. And what's interesting is it has everything you want to know about what's going on in Canada. For example, if anybody's interested in crime and justice, right here, all the data about crime and justice in Canada, you click here and then you go on and you can find specific. We're talking about business and performance and ownership. I'm going to click here. And all of a sudden you have data on business and performance and ownership. And say you want to know about business dynamics. How are things changing across time? So let's click on here. And you have a lot of data here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to focus on this idea of stats in brief, just a little idea here. And I'm going to go to analysis and just check out what they have. Oh, look at this. The impact of COVID on business majority owners. The Canadian survey on business condition in the first quarter of 2021. So what did it look like? Let's see if I can find. So it gives you a release. It talks about, many businesses anticipate decline in profitability in the short term. So it gives you the information and an analysis of the data that they received. So if you want to know what's going on, or what's the sentiment of your industry, of what's going on, you can look at Stats Can and look at some of their data. So let me go back here. Go back. And then, of course, they have this little bulletin. Conditions here, again, they have descriptive analysis of the conditions. This is the first quarter and gives you an infographic, gives you a nice summary of what's going on. So basically they say in the next 3 months, 70.6% expect to keep the same number of employees. That's a good sign, right? But 30% say the employees may leave. I don't know. 14% expect to raise their prices. So that is something that you have to think about. 41.8% expect profitability to decrease in the next 3 months. But 31.4% expect fluctuation in demand for their goods and services. So clearly they're waiting, they're seeing what's going on. They need information from the government to see whether they can open or not. So these are things that are happening. And then the revenues, what they think is going to happen, the survival rates, and so workforce challenges. One of the big workforce challenges, 24.1% of businesses expect that recruiting and retaining skilled employees will be a challenge. And because COVID has actually made people think about what is the value of their work, right? So someone's already being paid minimum wage, says, look, I'm a valuable worker. How come I'm only paid minimum wage? Do I need more? That's the challenge. That's people realizing it. So they're actually being picky. They say, these things are going on in the marketplace. And this is happening both here and in the US. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. All right, so there you go. So this gives you a nice type of information that you can look at there. So that's information. So you'll have that in my webs. When you get my slides, if you want, you can always send me an email in regards to that. Now the type of indicators. How do I know what's going to happen in the future? Well, the first thing you have to understand is there's different types of indicators you can use, type of data that can help you. The first is called a leading indicator, and that's used to predict changes to the economy. It helps you look at across time into the future. and it follows a particular pattern. So an example here are conference board leading indicators, and I will give you a list of them in just about 2 minutes. The next one is called what you call a coincident indicator. That's data that you use that moves with the economy at the same time. So that example of this is industrial production. So if you look at industrial production today, it's what's going on now. Okay, so these are not really, it's not helpful to know what's going on in the future. It's going to help tell you what's going on now. Now, something called a lagging indicator, believe it or not, follows the business cycle with lags. So it tells you what happened before in the past. So I cannot use things like corporate profits to tell me what's going to happen in the future. Okay, I can't use unemployment to tell me what's going to happen in the future because that happened already. So the future requires some different type of data. So what do I need to know what's going to happen in the future? Because my profits today, I'm accounting for them, but I already got them in the past. So what I'm going to need for a leading indicator telling you what's going to happen in the future are things like average work week hours in manufacturing. Why? If I see this data increasing, that means people are working longer hours. That means production is increasing. It's helping me understand what's going on in the future. Number 2, housing index. Think about that. If more and more people want to buy a house, that means they're also going to buy what? Chat, come on. What are they going to buy as well? You buy a new house, you buy?
Cars.
Oh my God, furniture. Yeah, absolutely. You buy. See what that's going to happen to the economy? Just that sense. So the housing index helps. So how do I know if people are really interested? Well, developers also matter here. Okay. So in this case, the developers, if you look at permits, developers asking for more housing permits, that's a sign that in the future, they think that demand is going to increase for housing as well. So that's what it'll be. So the housing index is very important. This is US Composite Index because the US is our largest trading partner. So if the US economy is growing, then what we sell to the US is going to grow as well. Do you know one of the things that's growing in price that's crazy right now is lumber? Because the US is buying more lumber from worldwide and there's a shortage because of COVID, right? And Canada, and the prices are skyrocketing, right? And so this is what's going on. Canada's benefiting from that because of higher prices. We try to supply more and that's what's going on. New orders on durable goods. That's like cars and things like that. People, when they think they have confidence in the economy, they start putting in new orders. The stock price index is also an indicator of the future. You see the stock market's going up. Clearly that investors think that there's promise. And if you think that things are going to improve, you put money into the market. Retail furniture, tax and appliances, that also is linked to the housing index as well. And durable goods sales, cars, furniture, except that. And then the other one is want ads. That want ads, believe it or not, if you look at the newspaper or the job postings, the more you see of that, you know that the economy is improving. Okay, so these are examples of leading indicators. So I thought I'd bring that up because people have that. Again, you can find a lot of this data on StatsCan, and you can actually see what's going on there. Some people ask about Toronto. I need data on Toronto. Well, believe it or not, www.toronto.ca has a lot of this data if you want to know in general. This here gives you a picture of a gross domestic product. What gross domestic product is what's produced within the country. In this case, they took it for gross domestic product just in Toronto. And that's basically consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus exports minus imports. You take away the bananas and everything else that's not made in Canada. So everything that's produced within Canada, in this case within Toronto, and what this gives you an idea of what's Toronto, sort of the industries in Toronto are like. So 17% of businesses in Toronto are related to finance and insurance. Real estate is 16%. Information and cultural is 6%. Transportation and warehousing is 3%. Retail trade is 4%. Wholesale trade is 4%. Manufacturing is 8%. Construction is 5%. And then you have these smaller other services. A big one, believe it or not, it's not surprising if you go downtown, is public sector. Education, healthcare, public admin, U of T's down there, York's down there, all the hospitals are down there. The Ontario government is down. So that is a big check. I mean, public sector and finance are the two big sectors. And then management and admin support, and of course, professional, scientific, and technical service is 10%, which is getting larger. This was a lot smaller before, and now it's getting larger. So tech is booming as well in Toronto. And also this is changes in-store and e-commerce sales. So it gives you an idea of some of the data going on. This during the sort of February to April 2020, despite the fact that retail trade lost 34%, their online went up 94%. That does not mean that it's necessarily eliminating. It's a change in. They did a lot more online as a result. Look what happened with one of them. This one is actually what surprised me. Furniture and home furnishing stores, they lost 69%, but they went online really quickly, right? They said, okay, you needed a chair, you needed a desk for the stay at home. That's exactly what this is reflecting. When I saw that, I go, oh my God, yes, all these people wanting a new chair, a desk, a better computer, better lighting. That all is reflected in just this piece of data. Sporting goods, book, music stores also increased online. So these are the examples. The one with the least online is building material and garden equipment and supply dealers. They were the weakest in moving. They didn't lose as much in store, but of course they didn't do as much online. So this is just giving you a refresher insofar as looking at the economy, where to get some of this data. Good enough? All right. So now, I can't spend too much time because I've got to do information. So there are two quotes I have here, sort of to get you thinking. Is in the age of technology, there is constant access to vast amounts of information. All right, and the people get overwhelmed. There's so much out there, and even the storm is so much that what goes on in the world, it's confusion, how you feel, how you think, how you digest this information, and how you react to it. So you have to understand from an economic point of view, what we're looking at is what information that's true, that's honest, that fulfills something, that is giving you information that is actually allows you to make an informed decision. So information from an economics point of view is really looking at the information to help you make decisions. Unfortunately, of course, with all the social media, there's a lot of false information. There's a lot of hypothesis. There's a lot of feelings, emotion, and sometimes that's difficult to sort of weed out. So it makes sometimes social media, it makes it easier for activists to express themselves and harder for that expression to have any impact. So you have people liking things and saying things online, but not in fact moving things forward because there's so much of it. And if you're a company or SME and if you get so all of a sudden involved in some of this stuff, how do you deal with it? So information is important. I'm going to tell you what the world we live in is a world of asymmetric information. That means you know something more than maybe someone else. And so how do we, if someone wants to know and wants to do something, how do we make decisions in a world where you have incomplete information? And that's the world we are living in right now, okay? So we have a world called what you call asymmetric information. Now, let me give you an example. Most economic models assume perfect information, that everyone knows everything and we make this decision and we price a good and everyone they know people are going to buy it. But in reality, we live in a world with asymmetric information. For people who are more like, I know more about myself, for example, than you know about me. Now, you read things about me on the internet or you can hear me, but I know more. So if you were to interview me, for example, for a job, you'd have to ask me questions to find out information more about me to determine whether or not. So let me give you an example. You are an owner of an SME interviewing two job candidates, one male and one female, both recent sort of Schulich School of Business graduates and are eminently qualified for the position. So what do you do? So what is the purpose of the interview, by the way? Anybody? Use the chat. Chat? Anybody? How would you do this? Two equally qualified people. select the best candidate. I select, but how would you do that? What kind of questions would you ask? Determine the fit for the job and the organization. Good, good, good. So basically you as the interviewer know more about the job, right? And the person knows more about his or her skills. So what you're trying to do in this interview is see if there's a match, okay? And you're asking questions. And sometimes the match could be, maybe there's other things that you require. Maybe you have requirements, maybe there are quotas of certain things that you want to get some diversity and things like that. Who knows? But the point is that this is what you want to do. You want to do what the match is because there's incomplete information. This incomplete information results in that people, now what you want to do is you want to signal as well. So sometimes that degree, first off, you ask for a degree. The degree, that's Schulich, MBA or BBA or whatever it is a signal that you think that that person has certain qualifications. So the degree itself becomes a signal with information, okay? Because what you expect is that degree has some value insofar as information about them knowing a bit about accounting, etc., right? So that information is one part. And then you want to know how the fit is. Would that person come in on time? Would they do it? Emotional intelligence, absolutely. Can they present? Are they able to deal with customers, depending on the type of customers you have? These are all the things that you try to do the match. And then you have to determine a wage for this person, right? Depending on the qualifications. So what this says is that's really interesting to note is that this comes into play, right? Now, I'm not going to deny the fact that there are biases, right? Malcolm Gladwell did this thing about, he did an experiment. He talked about this experiment where they had sort of this orchestra, and the orchestra was all these white males. And then they said, well, this is crazy. You mean there's this whole orchestra with all these violins and what's going on? So instead they did an experiment. So what they did in an experiment is that we're going to choose the members of the orchestra, absolutely. We're going to choose the members of the orchestra with they're going to play, but you're not going to see them. Got it? Because what's important is not what you look like, is what you sound like, right? When you play your instrument. So when they did that screen, put that screen, and the people who were listening who were to choose, it's unbelievable the diversity of the orchestra afterwards, right? So if you determine some sort of criteria, right, and then you stick to that criteria, it's unbelievable the type of diversity you can get. Just to keep that in mind, it was really interesting. So yes, we do have unconscious biases, and these things have to be sort of brought to the forefront. So basically what asymmetric information is one party to an economic sort of transaction has better information than the other party. So this happens a lot in economics. And so the question then becomes, there are two types of asymmetric information. One is called adverse selection. Let me define that. One party to a transaction takes advantage of knowing more than the other party before the transaction. Wow. Professor, what do you mean by that? Well, example is by this famous economist, his name is George Akerlof. He talked about the market for lemons, where he used the used car market as an example. And it went like this. Suppose there's no way, so you go into a used car market and you look at the cars, and the salesperson comes to you and they said, bonjour, monsieur, and hello, madame, please come in, look at all these beautiful cars. Great. And then they say, okay, but you can't drive it. You have to take my word for it, that this is the car. You put the price on the car and that's it. No way of testing. So you look at it, you go, okay, I'll take this car, but you can't return it either, right? Nothing of that, none of that system. Well, he argued, right, very logically, that if you have this type of market where you have an experienced good, something that you have to look at, try out, and you do not allow that all you'll end up with in this market is lemons, bad cars, okay? And that stayed for a while, right? Where, you have these used cars, but you don't have any information about what's the history of that car. Where did that car, how was that car used? Do the brakes work, etc. So another example is the US healthcare system, where doctors have more knowledge about the issue than you do. So I go to a doctor I have a headache. Oh my God. This is in the US. Okay, I have a headache. This hurts, that hurts. And then the doctor puts you through all these tests and charges you for every single one because you have insurance, right? And that's there is one party that has more information than you do, but you don't know if you need those tests. Is that clear? So the idea is that there's asymmetric information. So how do you deal with that in both ends? Well, in the case of the used car market, yes, Roger.
I just had a quick question, and then
Yes.
sorry to interrupt you. So in terms of the asymmetric information and obviously education, so like for instance, if there is 2 tiers of education, one is better than the other, obviously there's going to be a more educated population which has the better one, right? And in our community, I think maybe we're like, for instance, even when it comes down to our community economics, you'll see more of the predatory cash loans, and as opposed to banks where you're going to be paying higher interest that obviously at these money marts and everything else, as opposed to your average bank where you don't see in a lot of our communities, and especially the ones that have experienced some type of socioeconomic challenge, right? So I think, and maybe this is a question that you may be getting to, so is to, I guess, to bring some sense of equilibrium or balance to asymmetric information or the access education.
Absolutely. Now, this is one. The other thing is regulation, right? You cannot. Then some people have argued that these bank loan things, these micro loan thing is illegal. Like you can't charge someone 26% when a bank can charge 3 or 5, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is they believe it or not, the Grameen Bank, that give small loans, they're actually now being popularized here in North America, right? So it's really interesting, but you're absolutely right that education and these biases can actually be built into the system. In the US, for example, it's so expensive to get an education. I mean, it's crazy expensive that has created a 2-tier system. And one wonders why it continues. And this is where scholarship matters. This is where your group and having scholarship. By the way, I'm going to be donating money to your scholarship, by the way.
Right,
but the idea is just think about that. This is the idea of the market for lemons. But the market for lemons, to correct that's asymmetric information, is you have to allow, in this case, trying out the vehicle, rules that you cannot sell without certification of where the car came from. All this stuff is getting the information in the back to allow you to make that decision. And you're absolutely right that our education system has to have, but it has to start also from elementary up, right? It has to allow to give the person the ability, you can do it, have the scholarship start then, have the universities come to the high schools, encourage people to get educated to try to do it and provide the scholarships necessary for that. So I'm just trying to sort of encourage people to view this as when we have this adverse selection, this sort of level of information that's incomplete, what policies can we use and implement, and how can we enter into that model to increase the lack of information, or to decrease the biases that are in there.
Professor Henry.
Sir, Professor,
Yes.
before you move on, Charmaine Ross has their hand up.
Yes, please.
Hi, so just sort of on more of what we can do as individuals, I would say that we could also do some research. I think that's always really helpful, and it allows for us to be proactive in terms of how we access information. So one example could be sort of in a negotiation, whether it be in a job negotiation, or so I consider a job, when you're applying for a job, when you're negotiating, when you're talking about salary, I do consider it to be a negotiation. The other aspect would be, even if you are sort of wanting to share a business plan, or you're entering into a business arrangement, sometimes in both of those cases, one party could have access to more information. But you can always educate yourself in terms of what the labor market trends are showing, or what that business's profile looks like, to sort of in some ways equal out the power imbalance as much as possible. It may not be completely equal, but at least you will have more power than someone who has done no research at all. And so I think in answer to your question, you know, studying trends, doing the research, engaging with employees, you know, previous employees, former employees at the organization in which you're wanting to work at. That could be an option. Attending lectures with the BBPA and informing yourself about, you know, important topics of value, I think. So there's just so many ways in which you can educate yourself to reduce that power imbalance. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing I was wanting to share was with regards to the Malcolm Gladwell experiment that you talked about, which I really, really loved. There was also another experiment. I don't necessarily think it was by Malcolm Gladwell, but it was by a company, an organization, which I completely agree with. And essentially what they would do is they would have these jobs. They would hire some of the most desired candidates. And what they noticed is that I think sometimes people become overly confident and they don't necessarily respect people from all levels of an organization. And so one of their tests to hiring these individuals was how respectful they were with the receptionists at the front desk. So did that person deserve your respect just as much as the individual hiring you? Or were you less receptive or respectful of that individual and only respectful to the individual hiring you? And so I really love that experiment. You know, it's something that's really key for me. And I think in my own experience, even prior to learning about that experience, I remember I was applying for a particular position. And I was just so grateful for the receptionists and the individuals who helped make that process work, because those were the first people who I was seeing, and they were the ones who were setting up my pre-testing and all of that stuff. And so I was like, oh, you know, I was really grateful and just sort of like naturally grateful to them. And then I later met with the individuals, and I didn't really realize that they had remembered me because there's so many people who are applying for the position. But they did tell me after, you know, they were saying, I'm so happy you got the job because you were so nice. And that was after I brought presents for them, basically to thank them for like ensuring such a smooth process. And so that really struck with me because it's, you know, people do remember how you treat them, and they do remember, they do remember how you treat them. And I think it's just so important to not only look at the most powerful people, but also the people who've helped you along the way with regards to the process. And so that was, you know, you know, if I were hiring, that is something that I value in terms of people skills. I don't just want you to respect me, but I want to see how you respect the other people who may be considered less powerful within the organization.
That's an excellent point. And it comes down to finding out in an interview what you value, right? From if you're hiring. And if you know that, then those are the things that you look for, because you've done the primary search insofar as looking at qualifications. You saw that on paper. Now the question is, what are the other things that you can't see on paper? And now what a lot of people are doing, a lot of companies are doing sort of experiments, right? They're giving you tests. They're doing all sorts of things before they're giving they also allow maybe 6 months trial period to do that. So you're not hired, you're hired, but then you have 6 months for them to see how your work is. So these are all the things that are going on because of asymmetric information. That's how they learn more about you. And those are things that are very valuable. Thank you. Very, very important points that you're making. And it comes down to methods of curtailing adverse selection. That's exactly what you're trying to say, is that those are methods of doing that. How do you look at it? You ask those questions, you think about how they deal. These are the things of methods of going about doing it. In the case of the market for lemons, it's a market, right? So the market itself knew that if it didn't do something about it, that the used car business will go out of business. So they had to put some regulations to increase the trustworthiness of that market, because they were selling cars that, for example, that cars that were already in floods, and then they were reselling them after they fixed them up. But then, you had to understand what was going on there. The next type of asymmetry of information is called moral hazards. And this is when you're already in a contract. So actions people take after they've entered. Now, this is not before you get the job. This is after you get the job. Okay. All right. And they've entered into the transaction that may make the other party to the transaction worse off. So let me give you another example here. Here you've entered into a contract and you shirk your responsibilities. So examples is you hire a person to manage your business. Okay. But he or she decides to focus on her or his self-interest rather than the business. This could be the CEO, right? A person wants to be hired somewhere else, so they're focused only on making themselves look good and not anything else. So, and then the next example is you purchase insurance, and then you proceed to act recklessly. So, I have car insurance now, and I'm going to drive faster. I have airbags in my car. Okay, I want to take more risks, right? So this is the example. They use this a lot in sort of insurance business. And so what do you do? So how can you deal with this asymmetric information? Well, how do you curtail moral hazard? Well, in the case of business, you may tie the person's pay to the success of the business. Okay, so that's what you have. Now, let me be clear. This is good and bad. I mean, you've heard many stories in the US that you have these CEOs that are getting $1 million sort of bonuses, despite the fact that their business has gone down 50%. And that just doesn't make sense, right? So accordingly, it works when the economy is improving, but when it's going down, it seems to fail. But this shouldn't work that way. And so this idea of tying is basically making, so this is called a principal agent problem. How do you make sure that I'm the principal, I hired that person? How do you make sure that that person does his or her job? Is one way of looking at it is to trust that person. Cut through, some CEOs have, they take a cut, and some have taken a cut, and others have gotten an increase. And so the good examples in the healthcare business in the US. And so some of them have taken a cut, which is great. And those are good examples. But the problem is that it's not sort of true all across. And so these are things that we have to think about. And then that's one way of linking it. And someone has their hand up. And so this is some of the things. So one other way of curtailing it is that now the insurance companies, for your car, do you hear this? Desjardins and some other companies are saying, you know what they're saying? They're saying, hey, buy our insurance and you can get 10% less if you can put this piece of technology in your car. So they do what? What are they trying to do? You put this technology in your car so they can monitor how you drive. And if you're a good driver, they will decrease they give you lower insurance, right? So that's trying to curtail moral hazard. I don't get it, but I won't get it, but because, it's not only my driving, if they know but it's also other people's driving, right? So it depends on what happens. So they want to find out more information. That's their method of trying to reduce moral hazard. So those people who are good drivers, i.e. they can actually monitor across time and then actually give you lower insurance. So those are the things they're thinking about doing there. All right. Now, one other thing, and so has the internet and social media helped? Has access to more information reduced asymmetric information? Well, I've done good examples of this is Vax Hunters, right? Canada, who have helped people find where the vaccines are to get them faster access to it, which is wonderful. Of course, bad use of social media is anti-vaxxers and bad information about things, medicines. You have to be careful about medical, where you go. You have to find trusted sources. It's sort of the Wild West now on the social media. Before, there used to be some sort of gatekeepers looking at this and reviewed and things like that. Now it's kind of everywhere. So you're on Facebook and all of a sudden a friend says this, and you have to take things with a grain of salt. It's very difficult now with all this information coming in. So for some SMEs, getting information to customers is important, but now social media, you have two-way communication. So people are actually sending complaints on social media. Have you seen that happen? Anybody? Have you seen complaints about a company? Hey, at Bell, my phone doesn't work, right? And some people view that, depending on how many people are following you, And they'll respond sometimes right away. When people view that, they say, well, this is the way to complain about my service. So just keep that in mind that now SMEs are going to be involved in this as well. So it's two-way communication. So we now, as an SME, you have to think about, how do I communicate and how do I deal also with the good and the bad, right? So if someone gives you a bad review, how do you respond? And you see that on Expedia, for example, on travel things. So how do we deal with this type of information? And companies must now deal with communication to and from customers via social media. And they actually hire, some for larger companies, they hire people to the PR to look at things, to see how to respond, what's going on. Some have even said they prefer it going to social media. So, and they DM, direct message me, please. What they do is they find that someone complains, and then the company right away direct message and they deal with it immediately. So these are the things that are going on, which adding another level of work, if you will, for an organization, and a small, medium-sized business needs to take that into account. The other thing I just want to bring out, because I'm talking to the community, is this whole thing about carding, police carding, for example. And Roderick has mentioned that that in Toronto and everywhere they said don't do it. But people have to understand what is carding and what is that insofar from an economic point of view. From an economic point of view, carding is trying to deal with asymmetric information. So someone doesn't know something, so they then use their thoughts, their cognitive abilities, and say, well, this group is this and that group is that. That is hugely costly. Is that clear? From an economic point of view, all right, carding is extremely costly because you're blanketing one whole group, right, or another group based on what they look like or whatever it is. But the problem with that is that if you have very few people, then you're actually imposing a cost on everyone. So society pays for really a bad system. That money that was put into that to make that system work, because you get sued and everything else as a result of that, could have been instead used to get them to put into the community, to work with the community, to find out the causes, to help the people understand the information, to get better relations with the community, to actually not do that. And so these are the things that now people are talking about. So I just want you to keep in mind that the carding is about this, the idea about information, is that they don't have information, so they assume things. And so how do you break that? How do you put into it a system where you actually can do something valuable? So just keep that in mind. The costs of that are high. When you talk in that manner, then that stops it. And then so this idea about defunding and all that stuff, it's not a question of taking away money, it's taking that money and putting it somewhere else, which will help that situation, to improve the situation. We don't need a whole system for us to be fearful. We need a system that we can work with and build on. Anyway, that was my little rant, if you don't mind. It's the idea of this, and the costs here are very high. And what you want to do is look at the costs and benefits and say, this doesn't work. Okay, and in the book, on the chapter on information, they talk about that as why this occurs, and then how to deal with it. And one way of dealing with it, looking at the costs and benefits, if the costs are definitely too high, then put that money somewhere else to actually deal with the issue rather than just simply, sort of put band-aids on things and actually make the situation worse. Yes, Robert.
Yeah, and I think this is very important for us as a community to recognize, obviously, the asymmetric information that we technically are subjected to, like not having that information or having that access to it, right? The gatekeepers recognize it without a doubt, and obviously that's how they can continue to have an economy based on our quote unquote ignorance, if you want to look at it that way, right? And if you look through history also, disadvantaged groups, obviously in terms of, gender, women and whatnot, that's why you'll see such discrepancies in terms of even rates of pay, because usually white males have been in the seats to make the decisions. And obviously having that information in terms of the system that has been created, there's, I guess, so much that you can give and so much you retain for yourself to maintain that power. Correct? Or what am I?
Absolutely. And there is power dynamic involved as well. Okay, I mean, the idea that I've been there, don't get me started with the gender stuff, but
No, well, I mean, I think it's real though. Like, you know,
it
you
is
look at-
very real.
look
It
at
is real.
females, like obviously, I mean, I'm without even getting into anything specific, but obviously don't make as much as a male doing the same thing, right?
Yes.
Everywhere, at every sector, right? And it's
Every sector.
based on, I guess, that again, that asymmetric information that's just not been accessible, right? So I think obviously, and even in the sense of equity and diversity and inclusion, you know, that's based on, again, not having the information or readily available to
But
people.
it's also the language, right? So we as women, we grow up, well, children as well, we're told to be nice, right? We're told, you know, polite and things like that. And then what happens when we speak up and say, no, I want more, all of a sudden we're aggressive, or the B word anyway. But the point is that this, we need to, that has to break, right? That's saying that we have, and this is what's going on quite a bit. And so far as we need to assert ourselves in groups like this, and next week, we're going to talk about interest groups and how the power of interest groups, even though they're small, they have a lot of power in trying to influence and change. What does that mean from an economic standpoint, right? And also from a social media standpoint.
Sorry, if I may just note, I know there's some hands raised.
Yes.
Please hold your questions to the end, because I think you're almost at the end of your presentation.
Yes.
So we'll come to the questions at the end. Just please hold on to them in the meantime. Thank you.
Okay, so let me talk a little bit about productivity and capital, and then I know you're anxious to have questions, and I want to talk to you and get your feedback here. So productivity and human capital, to win the marketplace, you must first win the workplace and train people well enough so they can leave, treat them well enough so they don't have to, right? No, so when people say, well, I can't find someone, well, it means that i.e. you're not paying them enough, right? Or really that there may be a sort, depends on what you're looking for. And this always surprises me, because if you raise the wage, maybe you will find someone pretty quickly. So these are things that you have to, and we're finding this out. And train people well enough so they can leave, treat them well enough so they don't have to. And I think training is something that we don't do enough of in our companies. And training is really critical because it builds human capital. It's not only education that builds human capital, training builds human capital, experience. So I'm going to talk about things that help human capital now. So human capital is an economic passport, okay? And economists study poverty, income inequality to seek to understand and why are people poor, who is poor, and what can be done about it, right? There's a colleague of mine, actually I did my PhD with him. His name is Miles Korak, and he's done a study where poor children coming from poor families then remain poor. There's sort of this legacy. Well, something has to break that, right? That research was fundamental in saying, you know, they keep saying, well, that it's going to come out. I go, no, we need to go deeper here in studying what the economics is, also what the biases are, and be really, really honest about why this is happening, okay? And how can we actually, if we're aware of it, if we can measure it, then we can actually maybe do something about it. Absolutely, intergenerational poverty is a huge issue, okay? Because we need to build to get out of that as much as possible. And so human capital is a sum of sort of skills embodied within an individual: education, intelligence, charisma, creativity, work experience, entrepreneurial vigor, communication skills. All these are part of that human capital, okay? We build that, we try, and across time, we get better at things. So these are things that happen. The price of certain skill bears no inherent relation to its social value. That's a problem in economics because it's only its scarcity. So you talk about demand and supply. So if something, you know, is rare, you price it more, right? That's why diamonds, for example, are worth more than water, but we need water to live. You know, you see that whole idea. So but we go to war over water, right? So it's interesting to see, but that's a human right that people are talking about. So now the question is, now people are questioning this idea of what value is, and looking at, given COVID, the role of essential workers, right? And their value. So how does the two come together, right? Believe it or not, a plumber makes a lot of money, okay? Don't underestimate that. Because there's an expression, I'm not going to say it online being reported, because when water comes down, I mean, and things go in, I mean, you've got to get that fixed. If you have, something, and so they can actually get quite a bit of money. So these are very important skills. The persons who are collecting garbage are a valuable reason. Without them, if they go on strike, look what happens. That's why they use those skills in order to raise their income. Right? So these are things if they stop their work. So these are essential workers. How are they valued? How important are they to society? So these are things that people are now thinking about, that, scarcity. But the point is if there's a lot of low skill, a lot of people available, then of course they can say, I can get someone for less, right? So that's the only thing. So building up those skills is very important to increase the scarcity insofar as what your value is. So investing in building your human capital to increase your value via specialized training and education. And what I want to sort of talk about is this lump of coal fallacy. This is this one time, and then I'm going to stop here because then you can have my overheads on productivity further, because I think people want to ask questions. This myth that there are only so many jobs in the economy is a myth, okay? Jobs are created and destroyed all the time, okay? In the 1800s, we had something called farrières, which is blacksmiths who specialize in shoeing horses. But this job was lost, with the arrival of the automobile. Oh no, we've lost jobs. That's it. The world's finished. No, it isn't, right? The cars created even more jobs. In fact, we have more people today than 10 years ago working. Now, the problem with what's happening in COVID, a lot of women, for example, in the US, went back home. They couldn't, teach their children, have no daycare and everything else, and work for minimum wage. That's why the women aren't coming back, is because they can't afford it. So that's why Biden, for example, his rule is he's thinking about, we have to look at daycare, we have to look at infrastructure, we have to look at digital divide between marginalized communities. They don't have access to the internet. These are all things that require that people actually can be able to work. In Quebec, for example, they started a program with $5 daycare, $5. Can you believe it? Do you know how, I have twins. Do you know how expensive daycare is? Unbelievable. And so think about that. So these are things that are coming in, and this has to be, the idea of jobs and what's available is unbelievable. In fact, we have more people working today. Now human capital, like all types of capital, need reinvestment. So overall, 75% of the wealth of a modern economy is the result of the stock of education, training, skills, even the health of people. Human capital is critical, okay? So my message to all you young people is that think about human capital when you're going to school. It's not work, it's an investment. You think about it as helping you become better, to improve yourself, to actually get a better job, and then continue on. All right, so this is the year. Productivity is the efficiency of putting the two together. With more, we convert more inputs into outputs. That's what productivity is. So the more productive we are, the richer we are. And the other thing is, in 1870, for example, the typical, I'm going back to the 1800s, I love the 1800s for some reason, required 1,800 hours of labor to acquire its annual food supply. Today, it takes 260 hours, right, of work. So we have more leisure, but then more people are working. So these are the things that you have to think about. That's what productivity allows you to have. And also the costs of these outputs are also lower as a result. So productivity growth is what improves our standard of living. All right, so then I have, it's also not a zero-sum game. What does that mean is, all because one country goes does not mean the other country has to shrink. This just drives me crazy when I see that. What it means, if the US grows, actually Canada grows, because our economies are interdependent. It's really important. And so these are things that are going on. And so then last but not least, I think, why isn't the whole world rich? Given that we're more productive? Well, there's a lack of investment in R&D, right? In some cases. There's a lack of investment in people too. Can I say this too? It's also a lack of investment in people, all right? We have to put more in there. And now, for example, in Biden, they're thinking about putting, free college education, college, not university, but college. Low quality of labor from low investment in education. We need to put more in there, more money into the education, all right? The other thing is a government institution that do not protect private property, investments. Yeah, think about that. And geography makes trade difficult. Those are the only reasons. I want to stop here. I want so many things are coming on the chat. I'm seeing it right now in front of me. And I know people have questions. How are you doing? It's a hot day, but
That's right.
Yes, yes. So please continue to raise your hands. I know there was a question from Amani. If you're
I'm gonna stop my share. All right. So
Yeah,
this is next week, by the way. All right. Yeah. Go ahead.
so Amani, if you're still there.
yeah, I'm here. It was a comment when she was talking about the asymmetric information,
Mhm.
but just because what I realized in a day-to-day life is that the lack of access to information, because I see in many sectors we don't have as many Black people, people of color, indigenous people, all those marginalized groups. Not because they're not capable, not because they don't have the capability, but simply because they don't know. They don't have, certain people have information. I look at the vaccine, for instance.
Mhm.
Certain portion of the population, they knew ahead of time that science has developed vaccines that are effective. Other portion, they did not pass that information to other people. And that's why you see people being reluctant. But when you dig deeper, they don't have access to information. So asymmetric information is the key to develop, because once those marginalized populations are educated, we are reducing the likelihood of them being marginalized. Thank you.
Amani, I agree, right? So this is the idea of access, right? And having social media, not social media, but the internet has to be accessible, right? We just need, everyone needs it. And we have to have lower costs on that. There has to be fair for everybody to get access to this information. And you're absolutely right. And information is powerful. Right now, there's lots of different information. So how do we inform? The example I gave you of Backs Hunters Canada is doing just that. In fact, what they're doing is actually they went out. This is volunteer, completely volunteer, young people in the GTA, but they're doing this across Canada, have put this in Chinese, Hindu, all languages, all this stuff in different languages, so that they can actually go on to other people. They have this on Facebook, they have this on this, and they're communicating. They're communicating also to the children, so they communicate with their parents and then their grandparents. So these things are going on. It's amazing what can be done. But again, it requires people to think about how we get information, to whom do we need to reach. Anyway, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, and I think just based on what Amani just said and what I was mentioning earlier, like, so for instance, and I'll use the Toronto District School Board as an example. We know for a fact that there's certain communities in the Greater Toronto area that have a lower socioeconomic status than others, right? And in those zones, the educational attainment is lower than it is in the higher economic status communities, right? So in terms of trying to break, or I mean, if it's an intention, or maybe even the community should demand this, right? That more in terms of education, better teachers and whatnot are put into the poorer communities as opposed to the other way around, right? Because, you know, they need that information. They need to access, they need to have those investments from early o'clock to be able to change the outcomes of these poor communities. And again, if you look at the history, excuse me, it's just continuous, right? You know, you can see for the last 30, 40 years that certain communities have had the same outcomes year in, year after. But if you look at, for instance, Bay Street, you know, the economic engine of Canada, if a CEO was performing as bad as a principal or, you know, superintendent in certain areas, they would be out in 0.10 seconds, right? But it doesn't work that same way here. And obviously that continues to perpetuate that discrepancy in terms of information and access. So I think, you know, this is areas where we as a community need to demand certain things, because again, it's our tax dollars that pay for it in the first place.
Well, you know, there's a lot of studies right now coming from also the US where about the education and getting better teachers and everything else. And it, you know, sometimes it's actually they put in as breakfast programs in, believe it or not, so that when the students come in the US, they've had huge problems.
Yeah, we have it here too. Yeah.
Yeah, and so putting in breakfast programs actually make students more alert. I mean, if you go to school without breakfast, I mean, it's like me without coffee, right? In the morning, I mean, I'm useless. I mean, the point is how do we do this? We have to think of what ways of what are the causes, what's going on, and thinking about the families and what their experience is. That's what early childhood care is necessary to get, you know, people, their income levels have to start rising, thinking about what they're experiencing. I mean, in my case, I came from a poor family. My mother cleaned homes, you know, construction, and they didn't speak any language. And so it was very, very hard. I mean, I had to speak on their behalf as I was growing up because they didn't speak English. So these are the things that you have, but I didn't have internet then, right? And so now these are children now growing up, but they may not have access to the internet and things like that. So this is really critical, this idea of access, this idea of getting the information. And also they need to go in and find out what are the issues and how do we get people together and say, well, how can we deal with this better? But it's hard. They don't get the resources. It's not like these other schools where they get a lot of parents giving all this money and the richness. It should be a pool. It should be like the NFL, right? They put all the money in a pool and some of the money goes to the poorer teams so they can, because otherwise there would be too much disparity. So we have models already that look at this. Why couldn't there be, where if the money comes from parents, it also goes into a pool where then they can determine where the need is, right? Where are the needs? Because we want to build this and build it up for everybody, not just for one group.
So that was actually my next question, and sorry for just taking so much time. But do economists work, for instance, with the school boards to help predict, but also mitigate the outcomes we know that have been happening over and over again to change the tide of what's to come? Is that something that happens right now or no?
Yes, they do. They can. You just have to hire them.
Well, yeah,
Getting them involved. You know, get them data. They can run. They can do focus groups. They can do all sorts of things. They can use qualitative data and quantitative data to actually start talking to people. They can actually do experiments where they say, okay, let's, you know, with one group, one school will do this, another school will do this, and then determine which one has the better outcome, right? So
I wanted to shift the conversation just a little bit. So on Thursday, the BBPA and their partner launched the BAIDS program, which is looking at, you know, advisory services to Black-owned businesses. And so a question for you, for entrepreneurs who are looking to start a business or to shift in sort of the post-COVID-19 world, how do they deal with asymmetries or, you know, of information? Like, how do they go about dealing with getting the information they need to move their businesses forward? And then I also see a hand, but I'll leave that question there.
Yeah.
I'll get to the hands in the chat.
Okay, so let me just say, remember I gave you all the stats can information about what's going on and the leading indicators. That will help insofar as when do I come in? Number two, I think it's really vital that you know, you can always, you know, ask, you know, people to look at this information, say, well, what do you think? Insofar as what's going on, and you can always consult with an economist or even some others, and they probably voluntarily do this. And then talk about, so for a very low price, so talk about where you're going. Now for an SME and where to go, remember, sometimes when you start in a rough time, you learn more insofar as how things work. And then when things get better, you actually really go and really succeed well. But I think that the idea of the whole pivoting of going to social media, I don't think you then drop it. I think you need to further develop it. And then it's interacted with both the social media part, how you sell things, and also in store, how you do things. So it becomes more of a two-way street. So just think about that. Because, for example, Schulich has gone online for teaching. Well, afterwards, we're not going to simply drop it, right? We're going to do, maybe some classes are going to be online, some will be in person, but we're going to see what's the best of both worlds and see how to best do something. Because you can reach more people further away, right? And this is the same thing for businesses.
Great. There is a hand raised, Sankofa.
Yes, good morning. It's good to have a good intellectual conversation. Just two comments. And first, I want to just go back to Roderick because I work with the school board. So I always want to bring a perspective. I will never speak on behalf of them. However, with the TDSB, there's a gentleman had a thing called the conspiracy to destroy Black boys. And when he talked about the stats, he had a lot of people involved in the conspiracy, active conspirators, and those who were silent. And so the work within our families and our communities, we started a thing called Model Schools, which I work with. I'm a community support worker with that. And the whole idea was to connect with families that came out on the level of the LOI. Most of those families we work with are in those areas where low income, social determinants and all of those things. I'm doing a session on June 10th because for me who have done this work, I recognize it takes a village. And when white supremacy and racism and algorithms and technology and asymmetric and all of that combine, often things are not what it seems to be. And so I just want to say, when we even create algorithms, as I get older and younger, I'm like, who does the computer? Who are programming the information? And if it's coming from the same place that had the miseducation of our communities, then we need to have people who are going to be the creators, the co-creators, coming from a African-centered, a truth place, an indigenous place. And so these information can come out in form of liberation as well. But I'm just suggesting that we all probably have a role to play in making it happen.
Absolutely.
I agree. You've hit in sort of the idea that we all have to work together, right, to do this. And I think that it's definitely, and the AI thing, the AI and logarithms, there's a huge issue about that in ethics. The whole area about who the programmers are and what are they programming in? Are they programming in the existing biases? And they've done this for hiring, right? Jobs. And so what they use past data, people who had jobs, who got jobs, to say who should get jobs. Because some people are using AI just for hiring people. But then they realized they've omitted tons of other people in there because they've used the previous biases. History had their bias, they want to eliminate it, but they embedded it into the software. And so the algorithm, so there's issues that now people are looking more closely at. And the company then stopped using it as a result because they realized what was going on. Yes, discrimination, standardized testing as well. Because also the storage of the examples they give as well. So the people are looking into this about how do we do that? Again, is how do we deal with asymmetric information, but who do you want as well? Right, so that's it's a huge area. That's why I thought I'd share it with you.
Yes. Terrence, you have your hand.
Sorry, I didn't know I was so far up. Thank you. Hello, everyone.
Good morning.
The only thing I want to add or change a comment is that one of the studies that someone did was, now that we know that people are doing student classes online, is they flipped it where the homework and everything was given and they were doing, all the kids would do the homework at home asynchronous. And when the kids that identified that they had problems would come to class to get the extra help with the teachers in. And I see that that's probably where it's going to go. And that's, everybody gets the assigned work. You work through the lesson at home, and then you can get a greater response And again, I'm always of the mind, the simplest answer is probably something that you should use, Occam razor. We just look what the rich guys are doing for their kids, because there's few of them, and sort of model that for the poorer communities, because there's a lot more poor communities, so we can model it and use that dollar that we have to educate, because, you know, making learning optimal so someone can become a janitor, a garbage collector, and all these other stuff would be the same if you make, you know, help the person in IT, and it would help the whole country as a whole. And, you know, if we're trying to be competitive in a global stage, you know, we need to have that technology based. And I think all we have to do is model from what other people are doing that are working. And it's interesting to see that they don't want to look there, or anybody wants to look there. If it's working for them, model it, use the limited dollars that we have, and be the change that we want to see. Because I mean, we can't just wait for someone to change it for us. We have to change it for ourselves, and then tell people about it so that they can do it as well. Right? That's how I sort of see it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I suppose, you know, Professor, if you can speak to this from sort of the economist point of view, like my background is political science, so I see things slightly differently. Because part of the, and I think Roderick had alluded to this earlier, part of the asymmetries of information, whether or not we want to look at the race, gender, et cetera, components of it, the asymmetries are deliberate in many ways.
Absolutely.
It is meant to be asymmetric. And so some of the ways to address those asymmetries is not necessarily copying the model. You know, Terrence said, I'm disagreeing with you slightly. I don't know if it's about modeling, it's about copying the model, because the model itself is based on deliberate asymmetries. Sort of from where I would see things, but from, you know, an economist point of view, like, how do marginalized communities deal with asymmetries in information in the economy, sort of with the knowledge that some of that may be conscious and deliberate?
So it looks like right now what you're talking about is access to information. So the idea that the richer people have greater access because they can either pay for access or not, and where they live, they may not be able to get access. So and you're right, it is deliberate. For example, I'm working on some work on Indigenous communities, and some Indigenous communities don't have any access to some of this. It's not, the internet's not, well, there's a digital divide in some communities. Education as well is not there, so they're not having it, because, you know, in order to access the internet, you have to know how to read and write, right? You have to, I mean, this is not, and that's something that's people that don't realize that this is something that's important. And then some marginalized communities, right? You know, the people maybe don't know the language very well, so it's very difficult. And so what we have to think about is access as also to have people who are leaders in the communities to help them get the access, right? And that's, I think, what this group is doing as well, is trying to think of, well, where are the asymmetries? Where can we get some more access? Where can we find leaders that can continue and actually then speak to this? So next week, we're going to be talking about interest groups and the importance of their role in trying to eliminate some of these asymmetries, both of information, but just of existing asymmetries and biases. And your poli-sci background is very, very, very important. All right, it talks about also the big picture, right? Because you look often at the big picture and politically, and also institutions that have been created to sort of stop. For example, the Indian Act is a huge institution that was created that took away lots of powers and was managing the day-to-day life of many Indigenous communities. And now they're saying, no, we want our own people to educate our children, right? They're doing that. So in this case here, you know, where we have issues with regards to access to childcare and things like that, that's critically important for many marginalized communities, right? I mean, can you imagine if we had, true access to good childcare, how helpful that would be for a single mother or even a single father? and even couples in general who have to work many jobs. So this is something that's really important.
So to your knowledge, have, for instance, economic majors in universities work with sociology majors also to create some sense of study, obviously having the economic facts, but also the sociological impacts to then obviously suggest ways that we can break this cycle of poverty. Again, it's not good. It's actually, you could let me know or let us know, poverty seems to be increasing, right? And it's in terms of that divide. Is that fact or is that fiction?
Yeah, no, it could be the inequality in general is increasing, right? And that's because some people have said because the rich know how to not pay taxes. They can avoid it, and that's the companies as well. I mean, and that's why, for example, in the US, they're trying to do something about that as well. The other thing is also there has been not as much money put into infrastructure. The infrastructure insofar as helping everyone actually raise for working class, etc., to actually continue succeeding. And the cost of education has gone up, right? There's less money in universities. That's one of the reasons why education's cost has gone up. If you see the cost of education, the price relative to any other goods, I mean, you'd be surprised how that's gone up drastically. So these are the things. So that's why we need to put money in to have scholarships. We need to put money into helping high schools get better mentorship programs. We need to get these programs into high schools to mentor for young men, for example, to actually say, yes, we could do this. We can do this, and this is how we can do it. So these mentorship programs are also a signal of showing leadership as well. And it's not me that's going to do it. It also requires people, that sort of investment that goes in there. And it's going to be, from an economic point of view, it requires an investment in human capital. And that's what I think is needed. But, we need pressure from a political standpoint on people. You need people to go into government. So I keep saying, these communities now need to run for office, right? In there. Tika, are you going to do that?
Well, actually, I had another question for you, and I'm trying to first we have about 10 more minutes. So if folks do have questions or comments you want to make, by all means, raise your hand so it doesn't just become the three of us here. But I do want to, and I'm sorry, I'll keep insisting on this point in some ways. I wanted to go back to your notes about human capital, because I think maybe 2 weeks ago we were having a discussion with Nadine Spencer, who's the president of the BBPA, Crystal, whose surname I forget right now, but she's president of the Indigenous Business Association.
Mm-hmm.
It's an association akin to the BBPA, and Wendy Sukier at Ryerson talking about sort of women and finance and money. And one of the things we talked about was the ROI on post-secondary education for immigrant women and racialized women and Indigenous women is not necessarily high. So we're highly educated, but we're not necessarily seeing the return in the labor market. So we're underemployed or unemployed.
Yes.
So there is how do we balance the need to get higher education and invest in our human capital with the sort of the racial and other biases that exist in the labor market that make it difficult for certain communities to translate that investment in their human capital into actual labor market progression?
It is a whole, don't get me wrong, I mean, the whole social studies, just humanities as well, has seen this, because we have the high tech guys going, right? There's people going to engineering and high tech, and there is a discrepancy in wages and also opportunities. So the question is everyone going to go to high tech, right? And comp sci and all that, is that where it's going? And so the question, so now for women especially, is what are they learning? What are the skill sets? And what it is that you have to convey? What is, remember I told you what the skill set is, that human capital, right? It's not only education, it's also the experience and everything else. As if you put the whole thing, getting other certificates, this is going to be ongoing learning all the time. But you're absolutely right, right? And if there's biases in the market, how do you go through this? And so the return on investment in general for women is lower. But that doesn't mean you can't do it, right? Because the idea of not doing it's worse. This is what I'm trying to say. And so what we do is that let's try to find out where the opportunities are. And then now universities now are being very, very clear about how to help people get the job as well. That's one of our, the government's looking at us and saying, okay, you know, we want to know where to place your students. Where can they go? And a lot of them, for example, in sociology and poli-sci, they go into politics or they go into social work and things like that. There's a lot of people who want to work there. But then again, that's government money. Those are government jobs. I encourage people also to work for government. There's a lot in economics, for example, who do that. A lot of my students, for example, work for the Canadian government in different departments. But the good thing is it's a skill set. And so now what is the return? So what's the value of it? It all depends, right? So you may not get as much as maybe someone else. The question is, how do you break those barriers? We always need some people to break it first. That's, I always say that. I mean, unless we try and go through it and be there in their face all the time, we're not gonna go anywhere.
So we have another question. Oh, sorry.
Yes, and I was going to say we have another question from Ray. I think this may be our last question, just keeping an eye on time.
Okay. Hi, guys. Nice to see you, Professor. I'm actually also I teach at York. I just want to say that you know, the Black community in North America, we have Black people who are going to school, getting degrees, and on average are earning less than white people that finish high school. Okay, so what I think as a community we have done is we have put too much emphasis on just getting a degree. Getting a degree doesn't really, it's not what it used to be. Okay, and so as a group, as a community, we have to understand that the solution to our problems are going to come from us. It's not coming from anybody else. There's no white knight flying in on any broom to help us. We have to help ourselves. We need about 10 to 15% of our community to be entrepreneurs and to start businesses. Then we need the rest of the communities to support those businesses. If we could recycle all a bigger chunk of our earnings in our own community, we are going to be just fine. We do not really need to get a whole bunch of people involved. I firmly believe that we have all the knowledge, all the energy, all the intelligence, all the drive within our community to do whatever we want to do. We've been on this planet for 200,000 years. We know what we're doing here. We have a continent that we pretty much own. We're good. What we need to do now is start with ourselves. We have to build our communities. We have to practice group economics. We have to support Black businesses. We have to encourage young people to get into business. Okay, business is the entire world set up for business. These capitalist countries, there are lots of ways for business people to have advantages that working people will not. These are things that we have to explain to our young people, and we have to encourage this end of career, the entrepreneurial end, more than we encourage just going to school, getting some kind of degree, because the results kind of shocking. Again, I'm going to end with this one little statement. in the United States, a Black college educated person earns less than a white high school educated person. Keep this in mind, okay? And the last thing I'll say, as somebody that works at York, education is just like, you know, I have a business. Education is a kind of a business as well. So the education system is there to sell degrees. The education system is there to get parents to just run their children in there, and there's no accountability on the part of the educators. The accountability has to be with us as parents, to make sure that our children, regardless of what happens out in the education field, we prepare them for the best opportunities that are out there. The opportunities, I gotta say again, are in business.
Well, being a business prof, it's something that I understand a lot of people say. As I said, I've worked with Indigenous communities, and one thing they said first, their big concern was, the first was education. So they encouraged their children to become teachers. Then, of course, they had legal issues they wanted then. So then they encouraged their children to get into law, because they wanted them to represent communities to fight for their rights. And then the third one was business. They wanted them to go to business schools and become entrepreneurs and do exactly what you're saying, right? So some communities said will be Indigenous business to encourage Indigenous people, was also outside. So Ray, I agree. I mean, there are these issues, and the US is not a very good example to use. But I'm hoping that that when all this information comes out, it's to unite, to bring people together, to talk about this and saying, how can we as a community solve it? You're right, there's no white knight, especially not, that's going to come but as I said, Miles Korak has done a lot of research on this and this idea of poverty and how it goes out, and looking at policies about how to deal with this in his research. So I just want to say that no, it's a complex problem, and there are biases, and that this is going to have to change across time. It should have changed a long time ago.
Thank you so very much to all of those.
Amazing.
Fruitful discussion, I think, at the end here. Thank you for your questions and your comments. Rod, any final thoughts as we?
Yeah, before I say my final thoughts, I see my brother Michael Pinnock here, treasurer from the BBPA.
I'd like to see something.
Always great to hear your insight and the knowledge that you bring forth, my brother.
Thanks, Roderick. And it's not just the insight. I'm one of the co-sponsor champion for this program, and on behalf of the BBP, what I'd like to see is, a lot of times we talk about let's change the narrative, let's have discussions. We in the BBP is moving from that position. We're doing some stuff now. We're taking some actions, and one of the things I'd like to convey to my community, one of the stuff I do when I turn up each Saturday is to look at the numbers that is participating in the chat. And we have, unfortunately, come down from our average of 100 or so. And we are now oscillating around, I would say, 20 to 30% of that number. And we're gonna do a little research within the BBP to find out, is it that we're not getting the links out to people on time, et cetera, or is it in our community, the things that would really make a fundamental difference is not being taken seriously. So today we're talking about asymmetric information. And we want to go, as the learned gentleman mentioned just now, we have to transition into business. Well, you have to know business. You have to know the tenets of business. You have to know the pillars of business. And a program like this, which is teaching the fundamentals of economics, which is one of the foundation of business. And as you mentioned, Professor, education is not for free, but ignorance is worse. Ignorance is more expensive. So here's a program we're trying to deliver at really no consideration to the community. So we can invest in our human capital so we're in a better position to understand how the world works so we can change it. Because don't forget, if you don't understand how the stuff works, your chances of changing it is much more difficult. And so one of the things I want to appeal to my community, tell a friend to tell a friend to tell a friend, so the numbers can increase, so we can build our human capital, understand all this thing about asymmetrics and so on, improve the leadership of the community, not just the 5 and the 10% that knows and hopefully will help, the 90 or 95%. But let's bring more of those folks, get the numbers up to where they used to be, 100 and plus participation, getting involved in it. Because what I want to emphasize is we have moved a little away from the talking. We have done a lot of talking and a lot of narratives and what have you. We are now into the action, but the action is a little more challenging. There's a saying that talk is cheap. I'm not too certain if it's cheap because you have to be careful what you say. What I do know is moving it from let's change the world to actually changing the world is a little more step. And so what I want to say today, tell a friend to tell a friend to come out, because what we're doing here is educating. We're giving you the tools. So whatever you want to do in life, you want to start a business, you'll understand when they talk about leading indicators. You don't want to go out there now and start to make buggy whips, because that was in the 18th century, as Ari liked to go to. You want to make electric cars, or even cars that can fly. That is where you want to go. So you have to understand the principles, the basic principles. So I'm really appealing to my folks. Tell a friend to tell a friend to tell a friend. We have got professors from repertory institutions, active people in the business. The 3 doctors that we've asked to come here are not retirees who, moving from gardening to help us. These are people actively in the system right now. And they know how expensive education is. And they're taking their time and effort and giving of themselves to give us that information. Let's take advantage, get the numbers up, get the numbers out, so we can make a difference. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And on that note, definitely I would recap what you just said, just to definitely tell a friend to join us here every week, and not just here on Community Space, but all of the other BBPA programs that are throughout the week. In terms of a quote that we heard from an Indigenous leader, school is an option, but education is a must. And education can take the form of anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be the traditional, going into a class and listening to a teacher or a lecturer. It's just information retained and then technically then reverberated to educate the rest of our community. And last week I asked you a question, and that was a homework, and then definitely you brought the answers today. And I have one more question for you, I guess, for next week. So is education, last week you mentioned a little bit about monopolies and the government regulations and whatnot to discourage monopolies. But is education a monopoly, right? And I guess, if you got some time to think about that for next week. And in terms of it being a monopoly, if it is, in fact, then are certain communities excluded from that education? And I guess, and I'm using education generally, but, in the sense of, again, having access or withholding information or asymmetric information, obviously can have an impact on the community. So if that could be something you can think about over the next week, that'd be great.
Yes, the question for next week, and to get us all out of here very quickly, I know we've taken up some of your time. Thank you so much again for joining us this week. Please know that these sessions are posted on the BBPA's YouTube page, and that will be posted in the link or in the chat rather. We are still working to get that textbook out to you. If you weren't here last week and you're interested in getting the textbook, please direct message the BBPA in the chat with your contact information, specifically your email address, so we can get that textbook out to you. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Professor Enriquez. We look forward to our next week and the homework question and what your comments will be on that. And on that note, over to Victoria. Do enjoy your long weekend. Be safe and be well.
Take care, everybody.